Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a week or so since we've last had a video together. Um, Hopefully, you had a very nice week off. Hopefully, you had a chance to spend time with family and just relax and take a break from the craziness that we live in at the present moment. Um, we're just going to continue on with our lectures. We have two more for this unit, and then we are done. And then we're just going to jump into doing the written response and the test for this unit. Some of you have been sending me things. That's fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that some of you did that over the break. So that means that you were, busy working away. So I appreciate that, and I would encourage you to continue doing that as well. Yeah, so if you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to email me so that we can so I can help you as best I can. So we are still on Unit 3, Economic Globalization. We are still focusing on the question of, does globalization contribute to sustainable prosperity for all people? If you're following along in your booklet, this is page 20. We're going to look at the impact of actions and policies associated with globalization on the environment. So we're going to look at it from many different perspectives, because this idea of economics, the impact of globalization on the environment, it has many sides. Like a lot of things we've been talking about, people will have different opinions and different points of views that kind of round off this sort of argument, because these sort of things, when we talk about the environment, some people, well, everybody will have a different opinion for sure, but some people will be a little bit more aggressive in terms of their position. So we're going to look at the different points of views, and some of them will be very close to home, home being Alberta, and we will see how this province responds to the environment and the economy, and that precious, that delicate, sorry, not precious, delicate balance between the two. So let's just start. How are globalization and sustainability related? Goods and materials are constantly being moved around the world. So the world has always, if we jump back to historical globalization, we're always moving stuff. We're always doing things. We're always sending things over. Sometimes it took a lot longer. Sometimes it takes. Nowadays it's a lot faster. Countries are sending things over to other countries. People inside those countries are buying things at a higher volume now. Take right now for an example. Online shopping has become one of the only ways of shopping now. You can't really go out to a mall to buy things. So some people have resorted to just solely doing online shopping of products that are coming from all over countries, all over the world. So we're going to talk about this idea of sustainability, though. Is the movement allowing equal access to resources now? So some countries, being larger and a lot more economically capable, they tend to take in more stuff, whereas other countries who don't necessarily have the resources to be doing that, they can't keep up. So then the question is there equality amongst the nations of the world? And the answer is no, there isn't. Because if you think about it, if you take a small country with a very small economy versus a very large country with a very, very powerful economy, they're going to take in more stuff just because they're larger, and that will leave a lot of people without, that's for sure. So one of the ways that goods are brought around the world is through ships. They've been doing it since Columbus. They're still doing it now, although now the ships are much larger. So there has been a massive increase in the need for ocean-going cargo ships, because of the demand of products around the world. If you see something on the internet and it's in China, or it's in, I don't know, in France, and you want it, there's a good chance that a ship is going to be the one that brings it there. So in the 1970s, shipbuilding was dominated by Europe and the United States. So a lot of ships were being built in those in Europe and in the United States. But we're going to see it's going to take a shift because shipbuilding is very labor intensive. These are massive projects. So if you're following along on slide 4, you see 2 ships here. On slide 5, you're actually seeing the production of a ship. These are huge vessels. So they take up a lot of time, and a lot of people are involved in the manufacturing of ships. So the reason we see a shift to where they are starting to be built is because of labor costs. Labor costs are lower in places like Asia, so shipbuilding has shifted there, because you're talking about thousands of workers working on just one ship. So if you're in Europe or if you're in North America, you're paying these workers, these skilled workers, a lot more of a price, or a lot higher wages. In places like Asia, it's not as much. So a lot of ships have started to be built in places like China, especially. So each ship, though, kind of has its cost in terms of production. So you're talking about steel, you're talking about the electronics, you're talking about everything. So each ship kind of has its mark of how much it uses. If we take it all as a whole, though, there are environmental concerns in shipbuilding, and some of them are listed here. It consumes 3% of the world's fossil fuels. So out of the entire world, 3% of our fossil fuels are being put just to ship building and ship maintaining. So that's quite a lot if you think about it. It releases 15% of nitrogen and sulfate dioxide, very dangerous chemicals or gases that are produced. Their ballasts, these are used to keep it afloat and level. So these are just they're underneath the ship so that it doesn't tip over. So inside them, they use seawater is used. So it will take in sea animals as well, because it's not like it senses, oh, there's an animal here. I'm not going to take in the water to keep the boat afloat. It takes them in, and then it holds it in there, and it becomes toxic in the ship's ballast. So that water that's inside that kind of keeps it level, it's in there with whatever sort of chemicals or metals are found in there, and then they mix, and then that water becomes polluted. And then when it gets released, it releases it, and then it's an impact on the environment. So smaller animals will die because of these toxins that are released into the water, which then has an effect on the entire ecosystem. Because for those of you that are doing science or doing biology, you're going to learn that bigger animals eat smaller animals, and if there's no more smaller animals, then the big animals are also going to die, because that's just how the ecosystem works. And there's also these, they'll also transport animals to new environments. So imagine a ship is coming from Asia. It's going to cross the Pacific, and it goes to, say, North America. If it lets go, if there's animals inside of these ballasts and they come out, they're in a new environment. Or the animals that are on the sides of the ship, they'll be, if they get released, they're in a brand new environment. And one of the things that we have to remember is that when an animal gets put into a new environment and they have no natural predators, they flourish, and then they will destroy the ecosystem because there's nothing that's keeping them in balance. Predators play a really big role, because predators will if they will keep a population at a certain level. If there's no predator keeping that population down, that animal is going to flourish in a new environment, and it can damage the ecosystem there as well. So there are a lot of environmental concerns. Merchant ships are often registered in countries other than where the company is based. So it is kind of hard to keep track of these ships because they're constantly moving, and they don't necessarily have to stay in one location. They can go to one country, go to another. You know, they're going everywhere. So they could be bringing these environmental concerns all around the world. And in some countries where ecosystems are protected by international law, like for example Australia, and the Great Barrier Reef is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, bringing unwanted species into the environment there could kill a very, very precious ecosystem. So these sort of things we have to remember. We may not be thinking about them, but they are something we need to be aware of. The impacts of even the simplest things. So there's much lower costs. Many countries attract shipping because they have low labor regulations, taxes, and registration fees. So it's not like these sort of things are going down. They're going up because countries will try to bring in this trade, because like we talked about at the beginning of this video, there are some countries with a smaller economy, and they kind of have to lower themselves, or when we talked about it last week, the race to the bottom, to try to make themselves as available as possible, so that when companies are trying to find shipping routes or places to build shipping manufacturing, they'll go to these places because of the impact, because the lowering of wages, of regulations, of taxes, and then that impacts the people, because then they're sort of forced into that industry where they don't necessarily have a say. They just kind of have to go with the flow or else starve. So, like all things, ships become old and they need to be taken apart. So old ships need to be disposed of because they contain valuable metals that can be recycled. So the good thing is that they do recycle these things. It is a huge project. This idea of ship breaking is the process of breaking apart the old ships for its useful parts. For those of you that have seen Star Wars, the newest, I don't even know what it's called, episode 7? Yeah, episode 7. Where, what's her name? Rey? Yes, Rey. She's on that desert planet, and she's a scavenger. She's scavenging useful parts from old Star Destroyers and all these sort of things. So it's kind of like what they do there. They're taking apart these ships. So this work is often done in developing countries because low labor costs and fewer environmental regulations. If it was done in a place like Canada or the United States or Europe, there would be regulations on how this process would be done. There would be a lot more machinery used. There'd be a lot more regulations, masks, gloves, suits, and all these different things, because the law would make sure this. And there's also a higher wage bill because this is a pretty intense, an intensive labor job. And it's also very dangerous. If you look at the size of these ships, on slide 10, for example, you can see people in the foreground, and they're quite small, and you can see the massive ships behind them. So it is very scary work if you're on the side of that and you're just hanging there from a rope. So there's a lot more of a wage difference. So you do see this work being done in a lot more developing countries. Slide 12, there's a video here. It's 5 minutes long. Answer questions 25, 26, and 27. Back to more onto the disposing of old ships. It is very dangerous. It contains toxic metals and other materials that your body doesn't necessarily need. One of the most simplest and most common things is tetanus. So these ships are old. There may be rust. You know, you're going along and you cut your hand on a rusty piece of metal. In Canada, we do a really good job of getting tetanus shots. However, in some countries, that's not necessarily a regulated thing, and tetanus can eventually kill a person. So these sort of other materials and the toxicness of them is very serious. There is the materials released, so inside that there's that toxic water that's been built up. If it's stayed in there for a long time, it could be very dangerous to humans. The workers are exposed, and many of the workers will die just from the simple exposure to these materials. And there's a need for greater responsibility for the disposal of ships. So these companies who own these ships, there needs to be a better way of processing how they are disposed of. On slide 13, you see here workers in Bangladesh make just 38 cents an hour taking apart ships. 38 cents an hour is, in my opinion, this is economic slavery at its worst, because these people have no real say on how they are being paid. Because if they have an opinion and say, hey, I want to be paid more for this dangerous work, the people in charge will just say, you're fired, go. Because there will be thousands of people who want to take your spot, because in the developing countries, people, they can't be as picky, as choosy as, say, we are in Canada when it comes to jobs, because they need them to support families, and the economy doesn't really have a whole lot of jobs out there for them. So they are in a sense, in a way, tied to this sort of economic slavery. Yes, there will be people that argue this is work and this does stimulate the economy, and I would totally agree with you. It is a means of bringing in some sort of revenue and some sort of money into an economy. But at the same time, if a person can't choose what to do or how to be paid and how to be treated at work, to me it sounds like slavery. But hey, that's just me. So let's continue. That's enough of a rant from me today. Have efforts to promote sustainability been successful? So we've been talking about sustainability, making sure that the resources that we have now, will we have them in 100 years? Will we have them in 50 years? These are the sort of questions that are important not just to me, but also to you and to the future families that some of you may have. We need to know what we're dealing with in the future. So countries have been working on this idea of sustainability. It's not just something that you do in high school. Countries are really concerned about it. So in 2015, we have the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement falls into the framework of the United Nations Climate Change Initiative, so the UNFCCC. The agreement attempts to limit global warming by 2 degrees per industrial in levels. So they want the world's temperature to stay below an increase of 2 degrees, because it does add up. It will start to add up eventually. So 195 countries have signed the agreement. 168 have ratified or approved it, essentially. Each country plans to and reports its own contributions to slow and then stop global warming. So each country kind of has its own. Every country can go its own way, essentially. What this means. So Canada's signed on to it. So however Canada wants to work this out, it's up to us. So Prime Minister Trudeau has stated that by the year 2050, so that's 30 years, Canada will have 0 carbon emissions. So that is quite a tall order to fill. especially in places like Alberta, where carbon emissions come from our biggest resources, oil and natural gas. Other countries have done different things. So, for example, in some European countries, I know Germany has done this, and I think England as well, the use of electric cars. They are going to ban non-electric cars by, I think, 2030 or by 2050. So each country is kind of doing it their own way, but they all are still held to that same regulation that was laid out in the Paris Agreement. It's just however they want to go about it is up to them, and it is a good step forward in terms of promoting sustainability for the future. However, some countries, let me rephrase, not countries, some leaders are not necessarily on board with this. So in June 2017, President Donald Trump announced the United States would withdraw from the agreement, basically stating that it wasn't in the best interest of the United States. So in this case, the President of the United States is focusing his attention maybe not necessarily on the environment, but more maybe on the economy of the country. So just because a lot of people talk about global warming doesn't necessarily that everyone kind of sees it the same way. There are some people who see global warming and climate change as not true, so they don't believe in the science behind it. And I mean, that's up to them. So, like I said, this is a very this topic. It can stir up a lot of mixed feelings, and the next slide 17, is probably the best example, and it's a very local example. So the Alberta tar sands. So in the northern part of Alberta, we find the tar and the oil sands. Places like Fort McMurray were kind of built to around these sort of industries. So it contains a massive energy resource. We're talking 150 to 500 billion barrels of oil. That is huge. And it's a massive energy requirement needed to extract the oil, so electricity, natural gas, and oil. So it is a massive, it is our economy. There's no other way to put it. That is our economy. When oil is expensive, we do better here. When oil crashes, we crash. The last few years have been an example of a crashed oil industry, and we saw the impact of it. So for some people, the oil sands are their job. It's their livelihood. It is what keeps our province prosperous. But then there's other people who look at it and see its negatives. So they see the greenhouse gases that are released from manufacturing the oil or extracting the oil. And they also see the environmental damages to the areas being mined. So if you're looking at this picture on slide 18, for an environmentalist, it may not be the most appealing, because if you look at it, there's no trees there. And there's also the question of transportation of oil too. Environmental groups will say that oil pipelines can burst and damage ecosystems with the oil that's spilled. We have seen some of those happen. Probably the most famous that you may or may not be aware of is the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, there is an oil derrick, basically like a big oil manufacturing plant on the water, pulling oil out. It ruptures, and then we're talking millions and millions of gallons of oil spilled out into the Gulf of Mexico. It goes all across the coast of places like Louisiana, Florida, the southern United States, destroying and killing thousands of animals and plants. So there is that as well. People are so this sort of question of the Alberta oil industry, very highly contested. So on slide 19, video tar sands, oil sands, question 28, 29, 30, and 31. This video will help you answer those. So let's just keep moving on though. Have the efforts to promote sustainability been successful? So one of the things that has come up is this idea of alternative energy sources. we are looking for energy sources that don't connect to to natural gas, fossil fuels is what I'm trying to say. We're trying to find something that isn't connected to fossil fuels. So we're trying to develop energy sources which are less damaging. So solar energy, wind energy, tidal energy, geothermal power. These are things that when we talked about it maybe 2 weeks ago, this idea of knowledge economies, these are the things they're focusing on. So solar energy we know is solar panels. Wind energy is the turbines or those windmills, those massive windmills that collect energy. Tidal is related to oceans, so like things like dams. We don't really have them in Alberta a lot. In Eastern Canada, a lot more so. And then thermal power is using the heat from the earth. But they're very expensive, and there's few incentives to develop. So if companies do want to get involved in that, there are some tax breaks, and the reliability is often an issue as well. For example, let's use solar and let's use wind. If there's no wind, there's no power, and the sun, sure, it's bright, but if it's not, if it's cloudy or whatever, that could be a reliability issue. So there are some drawbacks. Obviously, there are some companies who are really promoting these sort of things and doing their best to promote energy resources that are not tied to fossil fuels. Tesla is probably one of the most on the ball in terms of this. So in Alberta, we have seen efforts by government to limit the effect of carbon that is being released from these industries. So the Alberta carbon tax, which doesn't exist anymore, it provided a financial incentive for families, businesses, and communities to lower the emission. So essentially, it was a carbon levy is charged on all fuel that emits greenhouse gas emissions. So it's $30 a ton in 2018. Essentially, what that is saying is, if you want to produce, carbon or any sort of greenhouse gas, we're going to charge you based on it. So the more you produce, the more you get taxed on it. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to lower it by saying the more you produce, the more you're going to pay, hoping that hitting their pocketbooks would lower things. So there was a rebate, so people were given money for people who were making less than $47,500 a year, or for families that were earning below $95,000 a year. So there was a positive in the sense that lower income families were receiving some of the money from this tax as a means to help boost the economy, or to help the impact of the tax on things like going to the gas station. So the revenue from the carbon levy, which the government expected to raise $5.4 billion, are invested in energy renewable sources and green initiatives. So what they were doing is they were using the money that they were taxing fossil fuel companies into renewable energy sources. So they were using the money to try to find an alternative means to producing energy. So there is a positive there, but then if you look at it from another point of view, it raises the price on things like electricity, on things like oil and natural gas, because companies want to make a profit. And if there's another tax that's thrown on them, though, they have to raise their prices just to cover that tax and still keep a certain amount of profit. So there is that point of view as well. So these are things that we need to be reminded of as well. Slide 23 has a political cartoon that it's showing the former Premier Rachel Notley covering up this idea of a PST and calling it a carbon levy. So a PST is a provincial sales tax. Alberta does not have a PST because of the oil industry and the fact that it keeps it's a source of income for the province. Other provinces need it as a means of being able to provide services. So there are individual initiatives as well. So there are people who take it on themselves to try to create this sustainability in terms of the environment. So often success is reached by individual action. So example, people have been putting solar panels in their homes, and consumer decisions will decide the future. If demand increases for energy-friendly devices, industry will respond. If people, not governments, but people, myself, you, your families, your neighbors, if we all start to say, hey, we want something different, then there will be a demand for it. And basic economics says if there is a demand, somebody will be there to supply something. So right now, we are looking at people who are wanting solar panels on their houses. If more people want it, then more people will start to produce solar panels. And then somebody will come along and say, hey, this solar panel is great. I'm going to tweak it around. And then boom, we have a brand new style of solar panel. Maybe it's more, it absorbs more energy. Maybe it's more, it's costs less to produce. It's cheaper alternative. So these sort of innovations happen when there's a demand for it. And it always takes just one person to tweak things or to switch things around to make a new product. Right now it's solar panels. In 50 years it could be something different. The wonderful thing about the future is that nobody knows what it's going to be like. So one of you listening to this video could be the person that changes something. It could be anything. So the idea of sustainability, it is something that it is crucial to understand because it is our future. It is your future. It is my future. It is the future of our children. Something to be aware of as well. So that is it for today. If you have any questions or concerns, please either comment them or email them. Continue working on anything that you have missed. Sending me anything that you have missed, I will mark it. Just so that you can all have really good marks whenever we get to June. So that is it for today. I will see you on Wednesday, unless I do something tomorrow. So just stay tuned. Okay, have a good day.